All right, let's get started. Thanks everybody for being here today. I'm Justin Clifford. I work at Bereave, and I'll be your host today. Loss Leaders is a program that is centered around how companies could and we think should step up when loss occurs in the lives of their employees. And the reason that we're doing these programs, Bereave is on a mission to help companies provide the absolute best possible bereavement response when their employees suffer a loss. And in that pursuit, we get to meet incredible people that can bring so much education to business leaders that are working to build a more compassionate and empathetic workplace. So instead of hogging them to ourselves and keeping all that knowledge to the confines of the Bereave studio and office, we want to get them in front of you. So that's why we do this. The chat is open and we'll monitor for questions. We're going to go about 45 past the hour or so, and we will have recordings out by the end of the week. And then lastly, a quick reminder that this program is SHRM PDC approved, and we'll provide the code at the end and in the follow-up if you're looking for it. Now, you're here for Max Yoder. Max is a two-time author, a musician. He's a dad, a husband, and co-founder and former CEO of Lessonly, an Indianapolis training software company. Lessonly started in 2012 and grew to 300 employees and was acquired by a company from San Diego called Seismic in 2021. Max, my friend, welcome to Loss Leaders.
This is going to be great, man. Thanks for having me.
Yeah. Hey, let's just get started with let's start with Do Better Work, which was your first book. The first chapter is called Be Vulnerable. And within the first few lines, you call it your love letter to vulnerability. Can you talk a little bit about the word vulnerable or vulnerability and the different way the definition is often interpreted?
Yeah, I think about vulnerability as outwardly sharing my inner state. So if I'm feeling excited and you ask me how I'm doing and I tell you I'm excited, that's being vulnerable. A lack of vulnerability would be maybe I'm excited, but I don't want to share that with you because that feels like an intimate thing that I'm nervous about you knowing. So I tell you, yeah, I'm fine. Or maybe I avoid the topic altogether. Maybe I'm nervous and I don't tell you I'm nervous. That would be a lack of vulnerability. If I'm nervous and I tell you that I am, that would be vulnerability. So it's real cut and dry for me, which is really just taking that inner emotional state and sharing it outwardly. That does not mean it's easy. It just means that it's simple. You know, I find that it's very difficult for all humans to get comfortable to varying degrees, right? To get comfortable sharing their inner states because it can seem like weakness. And often in our culture, it is marked as weakness. But as with most of the best stuff, you know, it's paradoxical. This weakness is actually a strength because when I tell you that I'm scared of something, that makes it more possible for you to tell me that you're scared of something too. And if we don't do that, we're probably talking about things that are pretty boring, like the weather, because I'm not sure there's a lot of interesting conversation that lacks vulnerability. You know, we're not going to probably bond talking about our highlights, the things that we are really good at that are coasting in our lives. We're probably going to bond most talking about the things that have been challenging for us, and that requires vulnerability.
Yeah, that's great. You said something interesting there that when you share that, how you're actually feeling, it opens the door for the person that you're talking to do the same. And we think about that a lot as it relates to, I think, our general relationships, but also we think a lot about it at work, right? Where there's supposed to sometimes be these two separate worlds, your personal life and your work life, and there are certain boundaries you can and can't cross. Can you talk a little bit about how you've seen vulnerability, or frankly, the lack thereof, really show up at work?
Yeah, I think vulnerability, if we're able to be vulnerable with one another, our communication levels rise. There's more that I can express to you. I can share potentially with you in a workplace that I see an idea that I think might be an opportunity for us. And I'm not necessarily sure it's an opportunity, which can feel very vulnerable, right? I'm putting myself out there saying, I think this might work, but of course I can't really know it's going to work until we give it a try. You'll have more of that in the workplace, in a place that allows for vulnerability, because people recognize that they're safe enough to do that. They're not going to be judged for sharing an idea that might work and then maybe it doesn't go how we want it to, or maybe it does. But what I'm getting at is you're going to see more people pointing out opportunities, and then you're going to see people pointing out more potential threats. which is also very difficult to do. If I see something that maybe looks to me like it might be off in a place that doesn't value vulnerability, it might actually be wiser. Yeah, I might think it's wiser to just not share it, because I don't
Mhm.
want any retribution if I'm wrong. I don't want to
Yeah.
be punished for getting something wrong. So I want to work in a workplace where everybody's eyes are functioning, everybody's senses are functioning, and we express what we're experiencing, so that we can see more opportunities, and capitalize on them, and we can see more potential threats before they become uh, right in front of us and urgent and imminent. Like, the iceberg's miles away, well, that we got plenty of time to turn. But if it's inches away, which is usually way too late, that ain't good. So I'm a big fan of
Mhm.
vulnerability because communication rises, clarity rises. I think it is the core ingredient for long lasting communication.
I love that. The core ingredient for long lasting communication. And so with that, kind of with that foundation, you mentioned a word, safety,
Mm-hmm.
right? We think a lot about psychological safety in the workplace, where you have it or you don't, or you have it on some topics or you don't.
Yeah.
But it can cause a lot of people to not have, just not feel okay about talking about certain topics. For those that might be kind of diving into the concept or the topic of what we refer to as psychological safety for the first time, can you talk about a little bit about what it is and why it matters at work, in this case?
Yeah, I think it goes hand in hand with vulnerability. I doubt there is a workplace that has strong psychological safety without vulnerability. I think you got to have vulnerability to have consistent psychological safety. And I think about psychological safety, I think how it's defined in many cases is speaking openly without fear of retribution. It doesn't mean that I can, call you offensive names, and have you just be like, "Oh, that's cool." It really just means I can say, "Hey, something's on my mind," and you'll listen, and I won't worry about not getting promoted because of it, or not, getting the next opportunity because of it. So very, very similar to vulnerability to me. They are like
Mhm.
kind of the same flow, and one comes out of the other. It's the flower, that blossoms out of vulnerability.
Yeah, so that connection, that connection point, goes together. It's the flower. Do you feel like you could have, just kind of thinking through this probably for the first time, but could you have one without the other?
I don't know for if you could do it for very long. I doubt it. I doubt it. I wouldn't be the strategy I'd bet on.
Right. So let's talk about the strategy you did bet on,
Yeah.
specifically at Lessonly, vulnerability and psychological safety, common topics around the office. Very common to read about points in this in your book, which was written while you were at Lessonly. They were, in at least in my opinion, having been your teammate, foundational to the culture of the company. uh, how did that happen? Why did it happen? How did you know to do that? Did it just
Mm.
happen? Like, talk about that a little bit.
Yeah, I didn't know to do that. When I started writing the book is actually 5 years old, basically today, which is
Nice. All right. Happy
really cool.
birthday. Do better work.
Yeah, amen, amen. A big point of pride for me is that at least one copy a day is sold to somebody in the United States of America. And
Wow.
5 years later, I didn't know if we were ever going to sell any copies. So like that happening, just it really, really amps me up.
Yeah.
But I think one of the reasons it continues is I'm not sharing anything that is novel. I'm sharing things that are classic. Compassion is a classic. Buddha, compassion. Jesus, compassion. Psychology, compassion. All of these secular and religious things point to compassion being this root where we can suffer together. And vulnerability comes out of compassion. I can suffer with you, and you can suffer with me. Ideally, not in a what's the word for it? Ideally, not in a way that is pulling us both down, but in a way that was building camaraderie between us. So
Mhm.
the book topic, how we came to write the book, was really a zigzag. Started out writing about what makes a great training program, and found that to be incredibly boring and disingenuous, because I'm not really
Mhm.
sure there's one way to do a great training program. Um, and kept writing about other things like vulnerability and sharing before you're ready with my teammates, and also on a note that I used to write every week, and that just flowed out of me a lot more naturally. So we decided after about 6 months of kind of going the wrong direction or so, starting to do something that was just genuine to me. Um, and really all I had to do was look around the lesson in the office and ask myself, when we feel like the wind's at our back, what are the behaviors that we're doing? And ultimately the book became those behaviors. We share before we're ready when the wind's at our back. We have difficult conversations to get the wind at our back when maybe it doesn't feel like it is right now. We highlight what's working. And we tend to have more setbacks when we don't do these things. These behaviors, when they are left out, that's when things start to slow down. That's when things get more complicated. Clarity goes down. And I think it's really important to point out something that you alluded to earlier, which is we come in and out of vulnerability. Sometimes we feel it, sometimes we don't. Minute to minute, it can change. This is not about somebody doing any of these behaviors or any of these things all the time. It is really just about recognizing when something feels off, going back to the topics in the book and saying, which one of these things might unstick me? There are times in my life when I am much more competent and comfortable having difficult conversations. And then I might find with a certain person, there's just one I need to have that I've been putting off. And in those situations, just being gentle with myself and saying, that is what it is, because that is what it is, and not trying to be like, hey, I should have done that differently. Instead being like, clearly this is difficult for me because I'm avoiding it. Judging myself harshly for that makes no sense to me. It used to make sense to me, but as I've learned to be more self-compassionate, that has really gotten into my heart of like, it's just not going to help. What I can do instead is say, I still think I need to do it. And even if it's taken me 9 months, quote unquote, too long, that's the judging voice talking. That's okay, because I can do it now. And, I hope at Lessonly, our teammates really felt that they didn't have to show up as this kind of idealistic version of the book, but instead to show up as humans who, when we kind of feel like things are working, we might know why now, because the chapters of the book kind of lay it out. We might be like, oh yeah, I did have that difficult conversation. I did share before I was ready. And wow, that project was smoother. And then we, build an appetite for doing it more because we see the value. And then if somebody's in a slump for a while, recognizing, oh, it might be because I'm not doing some of these things. So it ultimately was just a zigzag getting there, man. And really came from a place of, I was writing a letter to a guy named Luke. Each chapter is like a letter to a guy named Luke, another guy who's from Goshen, which is where I'm from, Goshen, Indiana. He was a budding entrepreneur at the time with a very big business now. And he would ask me questions. And I started thinking, well, if I can write what I want Luke to know in this book, it will probably be helpful to everybody. So started each chapter with Dear Luke, and then signed it off, and then took that out before we published the book. And I think that's one of the reasons that, if it feels like it flows in any way, it's because I didn't think about myself writing a book. I more thought of myself as writing notes to somebody who I love and care about.
Sure.
Yeah. And I think, just a lot of support from my teammates is also one of the reasons that the book kind of came out with clarity and came out in a way that was helpful. As 40 Lessonly teammates actually edited the book in small and large ways. Our editor, Ben Battaglia, was a teammate. We just had a lot of collaboration. So I was explaining certain things maybe poorly, and a teammate would say, hey, I actually liked how you explained this better when you talked about it, 4 weeks ago in that meeting. Or, hey, I heard this example from my grandma, and it might be the right one for this chapter. Just hugely helpful stuff. So highly collaborative.
Yeah.
I was given a lot of time and a lot of trust.
Right. Totally. It's interesting. You said 5 years old, the book, but Lessonly was born in 2012. So there were 7 years of building before the book was written. And I know the book took, 12, 18 months. But you also made it super safe to be able to have those conversations for those 40 people to tell probably their boss's boss, in some cases their boss's boss's boss, what was good and what wasn't. Like at what point while adding to the team did somebody or you look up and say, wow, this is a compassionate place, this is a vulnerable place? Was there a moment that kind of sparked the idea of the culture that was building, or was this just a kind of a manifestation over time?
I don't know. I don't remember a moment. But if it did feel like a compassionate place beforehand, it was really just me kind of surrendering to, if at any point I was helping build that compassionate place, I think part of it was just me surrendering to the fact that I was a human and wanting my teammates to see me as a human, as opposed to, a CEO who they might be scared of. I wanted them to know that I do not have this all figured out. I need their help. I'm going to make decisions that I'm going to come back to later and say that I wouldn't do it again that way. And you can too. Ultimately, I felt a lot of pressure from people that I'm sure was very unintentional. Of they would kind of put me on a pedestal, and I really desperately did not want to be on that pedestal, because all I felt like is I'm going to fall off this thing. It's just not where I belong. Where I belong is them looking at me like a comrade, like somebody who's in it with them, who believes in them, like they believe in me, who gives them grace, like they give me grace, and that separation being reduced just out of fear of, like, if I do have that separation, I set myself up for so much criticism that won't be helpful, that's going to hurt my feelings, and that I could avoid by just being like, hey, y'all, I'm making this up as I go, just like you are. And some people were scared by that. When they first heard it in the early days, some folks were like, well, then how are we doing? Do we know this is going to work? And it's like, well, we don't know this is going to work, which is why it's so important that we communicate, because it's so hard to do this in the first place. If we're not communicating well, the likelihood goes way up that it doesn't work. I don't know if that answered your question, but that's what came to my mind.
Yeah, it does. And it sounds like there's even to get to that point, and a phrase you used earlier was being gentle with myself, right? Being gentle on ourselves.
Yes.
It sounds like that had already occurred in your life, that you needed to be gentle with yourself. Can you talk a little bit about how for the people that are beating themselves up and aren't so gentle with themselves, that want to be, like, how do you start to seek that out?
Yeah, my heart, I think, was ready for it, but my brain was very much in the way. I built a very self-critical way of evaluating myself, thinking like I needed to whip myself in order for me to be healthy. But you know what happens to a person who gets whipped every day? They get weaker. That's not a strength builder in a lot of cases. I wasn't being what I ultimately realized is I wasn't being the manager to myself that I would want if I was working in a company for a manager, right? I'd want a manager who was encouraging, understanding, who was also clear, and also, wasn't skirting issues. So when I'm self-compassionate, it's not like I make a mistake and then say, oh, it's no big deal that I made a mistake. I would formally say, like, that was, I was so stupid. It was so dumb. Now I'm like, it happened. It happened because I was doing the best I could in that time, and it clearly wasn't, where I would intellectually want it to be. But that doesn't make me stupid or dumb. It just means I'm a human. So it's kind of going from like, hey, I should only be the bright and shiny stuff, and none of the none of the opposite, none of the unpleasant stuff. This kind of idealistic, perfectionistic view, and recognizing that that's just unsustainable, untenable. And if everybody else in the company behaved that way, it would be a nightmare. I wouldn't enjoy working there, right? If everybody else was walking around being highly self-critical and perfectionistic, I wouldn't enjoy working there. So my job is to be the thing I want to see. And what I want to see is people being gentler with themselves and being more supportive of themselves, because I bet they're going to get the wind at their back a lot more if they're not being the most abusive, father they can be to themselves. And I say father because, like, I have this abusive dad voice. I didn't have an abusive dad, not even close.
Right.
But that classical kind of do better, make me proud. You're not good enough. And I just went through a lot of therapy to recognize that I had a challenge of not feeling good enough. That feeling was unfixable. It wasn't something that I could achieve my way out of. Instead, I just had to recognize that by default, I'm good enough and so are you. And I don't have to do anything to earn that distinction, just like I don't have to do anything to earn dignity. That is just it's a God-given thing. You have dignity and so do I. Some people, myself included, at times can forget that about others. But it's the case whether we forget it or not. And then, once I read Kristen Neff's book, which is a book called Self-Compassion, it sat on my shelf for like 3 years. So much unlocked for me, because she's a researcher of self-compassion, and she was the first person to really scientifically study it. We had 5,000 years, if not more, of religious texts showing us the way there. But I think, we have a very scientific culture, and people needed to see that this is data driven. And she has sure done a great job of doing that. Kristen Neff has. And that book, just everything I would tell myself self-critically, that book would address and kind of show me how silly it was. And so just over time, it just got into it. my heart was able to kind of lead instead of this ego that had this idealistic view of I should be all the pleasant stuff and not the unpleasant stuff. And instead I was like, I'm the whole damn thing. I can be generous and I can be greedy. I can be quick to judgment, and I can also be very thoughtful in the way I evaluate something. Any of the binaries you could think of the human condition, lazy and a go-getter, I can be all of them in different contexts. And accepting that and allowing that just means I can see myself more clearly. Like, I just would like to challenge anybody to, I guess I wouldn't want a doctor, I wouldn't want a crafts person to do something with their eyes blindfolded. And often when we're judging ourselves, we are by definition obscuring things from our own view about ourselves because it hurts too much to look at them. Because we know that if we see those things, we have to then be judgmental and harsh. So we just kind of don't want to see them. And often instead, we just project them on other people. But if I can look at myself honestly without fear of being harsh to myself, I have a clearer-eyed view of how I'm operating, and that doesn't mean I'm instantly going to be able to change my challenges, because that's not how challenges work. Some of them take decades. It just means that I can see them more clearly. I think judgment is it greatly obscures whatever it is that we're trying to evaluate, whereas compassion allows me to have a more honest look at something.
Yeah. I mean, we've talked about psychological safety and vulnerability and being gentle with ourselves and compassion. These are, from a business perspective, pretty squishy CFO type topics, right? Squishy boardroom topics. Don't have great metrics to define these. And you kind of alluded to it at the beginning. But if you think back, what do you think that making vulnerability and psychological safety and compassion a priority at Lessonly meant to the company as a business, not just a building full of people?
Yeah, I'd love to answer that question, but I'd first love to just talk about the kind of squishy, non-metric driven stuff, because I think if we're honest with ourselves, like the word transcendent, when something is transcendent, that means it's beyond words. And the most beautiful, enriching, joyful, and also painful experiences fit the bucket of being transcendent. I cannot really tell you with words what that thing feels like or is. I can vaguely describe it, but it's not the same thing. It's like if I, read about giving birth and then tried to explain to my wife what it was like to give birth, having read about it, she'd be like, it's nothing like that. I have given birth, right? But that's a transcendent experience that only by doing it can we really experience it, and everything else is just barely touching it. So what I'm getting at is, I think some of the most important stuff in life, if not all of the most important stuff in life, ain't going to have a great metric around it. And I think just allowing ourselves to be okay with that is these emotional, spiritual, relatedness focused things. We can't measure them, and without probably leaving a lot out, and maybe we've missing the entire point, but we can feel them. You go in a place where you feel safe, and you know it because of how you're communicating. You know it because how your body is relaxed instead of tight. We can feel it all. And that's, enough measurement for me. But in terms of work, I want to go back to your question, but I actually forget exactly how you phrased it. So can you tell me again?
That's right. Yeah, well, when you're sitting in a boardroom and you're talking about these feelings, but yet there's a business to run that does run on metrics. Having made these, let's call them transcendental, if I'm saying that right.
Yeah, transcendental. Yeah.
Transcendental topics a priority. What were the business outcomes that you think emerged because of those things, even though you can't actually measure them?
Yeah, they, like I keep saying, when they put the wind at our back, that just means that person who's making that sales call feels more comfortable doing it. And therefore, when they're on that sales call with the customer, because that customer is a human, can probably sense the calmness in the person's voice. And they might not get that when the other salesperson from the other, competing company calls. And those cues, I think, close deals. When I'm talking to Justin at Lessonly, if I'm putting on a customer hat, he doesn't feel like he's desperate. I sense he's having fun. I sense he is calm. Who do I want to work with? The person who is that, or the person who is kind of pushing on me and maybe getting a little aggressive, I think we just won hell of a lot more deals because our team was calmer and was having fun, and
Sure.
people want to be around calm and fun. So it influenced the metrics in that way. But I'll
Mhm.
also, we had the benefit of operating in an economy that was incredibly strong. So I think we were always growing. Fortunately, I knocked on wood, like I need that to keep happening, but um,
Right.
but that's just old habit. And I think that was also for folks who maybe thought relatedness and compassion and psychological safety were squishy. The metrics were going up, so they trusted
Mhm.
that whether that was doing anything or not, they gave me some space for it because hey, the,
Sure.
the metrics are going in the right direction. I
Right.
imagine it gets a lot tougher when, even though that is important, just because the business and the market are not a fit. I can see that getting pushed to the side a lot faster, and I think always to the detriment of the business,
Mhm.
simply because the market and the product aren't the right fit for one another, not because
Right.
relatedness and compassion don't work. Like,
Sure.
yeah, baby
Yeah.
bathwater sort of thing there.
Yeah. Yeah. Love it. Thank you. I'm gonna take a hard right for a second.
Please.
You've suffered significant loss in your life, especially pretty recently. Can you talk a little bit about Drake and losing Drake?
Yeah, my best buddy Drake. I've got a group of 7. I'm in a group of 7 people who we've been friends since preschool on up. And Drake and I went to preschool together, and we were college roommates every year. And very few people knew me like he did. And one day in January of 2022, he went snowshoeing on a Saturday, and with his girlfriend Hannah and their dog, and they were killed in an avalanche. Just wrong place, wrong time. Um, I had been with Drake 30 days before that. He had come to visit actually twice in the prior 60 days. He lived in Colorado Springs, which is why he was in avalanche territory. Um, and nothing rocked my world in such a depressing and difficult way like his death.
Mhm.
I actually grew up with a dad who owns a funeral home. My grandpa started a funeral home, and then his 2 sons ran that funeral home, and my dad was one of those people. And so I was around death a lot. If I wanted to go see my dad in the middle of the day, because the funeral home was attached through a driveway to my actual house, he would often go to work, and I could be at home and just walk to see him when I needed something. And that meant
Mhm.
walking into the embalming room where, somebody is being embalmed. So saw a lot of dead people. But what I realized when Drake died is I could see thousands of dead people and still not personally understand loss.
Mhm. Mhm.
Because when he died, it didn't feel all the intellectual understanding, in air quotes, I'd say, it made it very clear to me that it was nothing like I thought it was.
Sure.
I told myself I was more prepared for it than I really was. I don't know if you can be prepared for it, but
Right.
I spent about 14 months in a deep hole, and I didn't feel drive. So
Mhm.
I've been very fortunate in my life to feel a sense of drive, like hey, I'm get up in the morning, I'm gonna make something. I'm going to create something. I
Mhm.
think my drive is actually clocked so high that it's becoming more of a curse than a gift. At certain times it's a gift, certain times it's a curse. But I
Sure.
lost all my drive. Just
Mhm.
and I've never felt that before, and I didn't know if it was ever going to come back. My wife was incredibly patient with me. I smoked too much. I drank too much. I emotionally numbed myself to not have to feel it. And the things that I was feeling was like a it was like this spirit of grief flowing through me that was totally its own thing. I was not in charge of it, and that was very clear. It did its own thing on its own time, and oftentimes I didn't want it to be around, so I would just try to numb myself away from it. And wow, was it painful? So I realized a lot of things in that experience. One of which is something you're addressing directly, which is we have very poor our commercial economy is very poor at recognizing how long it can take for somebody who has lost a loved one to really be able to be, a worker again. I was in a very fortunate position where work was not required of me when Drake died. Outside of my family, we had already sold Lessonly to Seismic, and Doug, the CEO of Seismic, I was still an employee there, but I, let him know that it was my time to go, and he was just couldn't have been gentler with me. So what I'm getting at is it was something that is indescribable, and I'm just doing my best to
Mhm.
give you, use some words to try to give you a sense of color. Um, but it's much bigger than anything I've ever experienced before.
Mhm.
And
Yeah.
I think, having experienced that loss, it's much easier for me to go take walks with people who have just, lost someone and understand that there's not a thing I can say to make that feel better for them. But
Mhm.
just being a listening ear is really what we need in a
Sure.
lot of cases. Even just
Yeah.
somebody to sit with quietly. So many
Mhm.
times you and other people would sit with me and we don't have to say things. We just need to be
Mhm.
together.
Mhm.
But man, I couldn't have imagined going back to work 2 weeks later.
Yeah.
It just wasn't. I wasn't there.
Right. Right. And like you, and a big part of the reason what we're doing, right? You talked about uh commercially not really ready, whether that's at work or just trying to figure out life, because it's a new life after loss.
Hmm.
You enter a
Very
new
much.
life. And um the workplace, as you know, and having the conversations that we've had, but it's just so far um beyond where we think, anyway, we need to be in terms of support. And that's not just policy, right? You said 2 weeks. Most of the companies that we encounter, um Drake's loss the loss of Drake, I should say, um that wouldn't have been covered in most
Right.
bereavement policies, right?
Because
uh
he's not my family biologically. Is that why? Or you tell me.
Exactly, exactly. Not a bloodline relative, right? We've seen screenshots on Reddit of things like, we bereavement policy doesn't cover friends. Sorry, right?
Hmm.
And understanding the family dynamics have changed, and just the way that we move through life is different than most bereavement policies actually reflect.
Yeah.
So when you think about this experience, and let's just start with policy, because policy is just one piece, right, of the whole bereavement response from a company. If you are in a position to write a policy or procedures for a company around bereavement, having been through what you've been through
Yeah.
in that 14 months, and since then, what are some of the things you think you might prioritize?
Justin, I would be making that up on the fly because
Mhm.
it has not crossed my mind to kind of scope out. I don't plan to go run a business again, so it hasn't really crossed my mind to
Mhm.
scope out a policy. Um, but similarly to how we treat new life, where
Mhm.
we have weeks or months, one of my biggest regrets at Lessonly was giving 6 weeks for the secondary caregiver and 12 weeks for the primary caregiver, because it's not enough. It's not enough. The best thing we
Mhm.
can do for our children is be present with them, especially in those earliest, tenderest times, without feeling stressed. So it would make my heart sing to a great degree if we had a federal government that would be more comfortable. We, I think, are one of two countries in the entire world that doesn't have any federal support for folks who have a maternity leave or paternity leave. Um, and that is a goddamn shame.
Mhm.
So I would probably think similarly to, how do we think about new life, and then should we have something similar at the end of life? And some people want to come back to work after a week because they want to occupy their minds. I mean, many of my friends who are
Sure.
also close to Drake were like, work. One of them actually told me, I don't know how you're doing it because work is the reason that I don't feel like I'm losing my mind right now. And,
Mm.
some of that might be
Mhm.
escaping, which I told you I was doing plenty of escaping, no judgment there.
Sure.
Um, but other parts of it might just be participation can be healing, right? And
Mhm.
withdrawing and silencing oneself off is not going to be healing for long. I might need some of that time, but I also need to stay participating in the world in some way because that's a sense of aliveness. Um,
Mhm.
so a long way of saying I don't really know, but I would probably look to the best maternity and paternity policies out there and say, what can we learn from
Mhm.
these?
Yeah. Yeah, totally. Um, And obviously the reason we ask that is just because of the kind of the archaic nature of thinking through bereavement, right? In
Yeah.
general, it's much easier to slide a policy in place and kind of cross your fingers and hope that it's not going to happen, that you're not going to need it,
Yeah.
than it is to spend a lot of time and thought and energy in it until you need it. I want to bring it back to the vulnerability and the psychological safety and thinking about how impactful, whether it's loss or not, right? Traumatic life events, or just, I mean, sometimes just life events,
Hmm.
whether they're traumatic or not. Um, I think a lot about the differences in an environment for that person, that are an environment of psychological safety and vulnerability versus one that is not
Hmm.
a vulnerable and psychological safe environment. As you think through that, can you think about the differences that might occur in somebody returning into work from a disruptive life event, in those two environments, and what that experience might look like?
Yeah, I imagine the person in a psychologically unsafe environment is not going to clearly communicate what's going on with them. So we will probably not be very good at allocating a proper load to, proper workload to them. We will
Mhm,
presume that they are functioning at full capacity because they're hiding the fact that they're not. We can probably see their body language, right? But somebody just won't speak up. And in not speaking up, I went I took myself out of the mix during during the loss of Drake. I didn't want to see other people. I wanted to be alone with my sadness. And my I have a couples therapist, and then I have a personal therapist. And our couples therapist, Kimberly, said, um, when I was sharing that I wanted to be alone a lot, she said, "Max, is that you talking, or is that your sadness talking?"
mm,
And what I realized is, my sadness gets to continue to be active. If sadness in me is like a person that wants to stay alive, it wants to keep surviving, and it feels unsafe if it's not being activated. Me being alone is how it stays activated. You know.
mhm, mhm,
So what I'm getting at is, I think you'll probably have employees who are withdrawn, but they're hiding it.
mhm,
And we could just, even if we can't heal anything in other people, which we can't, we can support and relate and just say, how are you? And sometimes when I'd get asked about Drake, the how are you, I would just start crying.
mhm,
And that release, so therapeutic. I'm starting to
mhm,
believe that crying is one of the greatest levers for me to feel fully in my spirit, is
mhm,
just sobbing out things that have been painful to me. And in a psychologically unsafe place, it ain't going to happen. What it will probably happen is the person will get frustrated because they don't feel like they're really being related to by their employer. Don't feel like they're being cared for. Um, and they actually might become destructive to the business. I'm sure that doesn't happen every time, but I can
sure.
absolutely see where people start to get so wound up and frustrated with the fact that it seems like the world doesn't care. Um,
Mhm,
or their employer doesn't care, that they're just like, well, then screw you then. I'm going to do this actually poorly on purpose. But when we feel
right.
love, we very rarely want to undermine that. We want
Mhm,
to respect it and admire it and be grateful. And I find that if in a trusting workplace, people respond by going, "It feels so nice to be trusted. I want to kick ass for this place."
mhm, mhm.
Yeah, a lot there,
Yeah.
but I hope it was
Yeah.
helpful.
No, very, very much so. And um, I didn't say it, and I'm realizing I didn't say it, but we've talked about Drake, but I don't know how many times you've talked publicly in front of other people about Drake. And I know just from a couple of these comments that your ability and willingness to have that conversation is a touching thing. So thank you for sharing that. And
Thanks for letting me.
yeah, it's um, not something that we take lightly. So,
Yeah,
really
it's
appreciate your
therapeutic, man.
willingness to do that. Good.
It's therapeutic for me. I
Mhm.
appreciate it, and I'm not ashamed of it. I'm not
Sure.
ashamed of how poorly, I will use air quotes again. I didn't ideally cope. I
Mhm.
didn't just let it flow, but I'm not
Mhm.
ideal, and
Sure.
I'm not ashamed of that. It was very difficult, and I doubt I'm alone in that. and I'm
Yeah.
doubting I'm alone in my unhealthy coping mechanisms. So just saying
Sure.
it out loud, I hope I
Yeah.
had a wife, Justin, who allowed me to do what I was doing while still having boundaries. Like, hey,
Mhm.
Max, you can stay up and smoke a joint, but you still got to get up in the morning and take care of your daughter.
Mhm.
Like,
Mhm.
I'm not going to tell you what to do because I know that that'll only cause you to want to do that thing more and just build resentment. I'm not going to resent you
Mhm.
for this. I know you're in pain, but you still
Mhm.
have to be with your daughter in the morning.
Sure.
And having that person who is creating boundaries, but not trying to scare me into behaving a certain way because she feels scared was
Mhm.
so monumentally helpful.
Sure.
I'm not sure I could have done it without that. If
Mhm.
I would have felt like I was letting my wife down and she was judging me and she was scared and trying to fix me and hurry up the process,
Mhm.
whew, that sounds brutal. So
Mhm.
I'm
Yeah.
hugely grateful to Jess for the maturity and the presence with which she was able to
Mhm.
show up to me.
Yeah, no doubt, no doubt. And I know you've said those things to her before, and just for just for her awareness, we'll clip that over and send it to her, and she can hear it on repeat if she needs to.
I don't think that'll hurt, man. Yeah, I don't think that'll hurt.
Right. Well, Max, thank you so much for your vulnerability, for walking us through how vulnerability and psychological safety can show up in the workplace. Talking about Drake, talking about your feelings, talking about how you cope. All of those things are important for humans to hear, especially humans that haven't been through a loss, but also anybody who's managing humans
Mhm.
that might not understand those feelings. So the impact that you're having today is going to live a long time, and it's going to be you're going to continue to reach and touch a lot of people through that. So thank you very much. Very generous of you.
Justin, love you, man. Thank you.
Love you too. Um, on a little bit more logistical note, speaking of
Yeah.
hard rights, uh, anybody looking for their SHRM credit, we'll put it up. The ID is coming up, but we will also up on the screen, but we will also send it in the
Cool.
follow up. And Max, if you weren't familiar, professional development is important to an organization called SHRM
Oh
for
yeah.
HR professionals,
Yeah.
and they get credit towards their professional education today because you have delivered the education that you have.
That's cool. That's cool.
Isn't it? Yeah.
Yeah.
Um, so as of now, by the way, we are off until probably 3:13. We might sneak in a show on March 7th. We're toying around with the idea of an AMA with a few folks. Ask me anything for those of you that are not on Reddit like me, and I had to learn that. But make plans if you're interested for 3:13 at the very least when Max, your friend as well as my friend Liesel Mertes joins us.
Heck yeah.
Liesel is the founder of Handle with Care, and she consults businesses in the importance and impact of empathy in the workplace. A lot of the conversation that we just talked about, except Liesel coaches it as a profession, as her job, and she shows companies how to build the compassionate and empathetic culture that they desire to build. I've personally attended Liesel's workshops. It's a must attend in my view. So if you're interested in that, that's coming up. We'll get you an invite. Also, if you're interested in learning more about how Bereave can help you support your teammates in their toughest moments, give us a shout. We'd love to talk. Until then, thanks for being here, Max. Thank you again, and
My
can't wait to see
pleasure.
you next.
Yeah, I'm
Talk
excited
soon.
for Liesel. She rocks. I'll be there for that.
Awesome. Thanks, Max.
Thanks. Thanks, y'all.
Thanks, everybody.